In this section, we're going to look at ethics and fairness, probably the most important topic of these that we are covering in this lecture series. Negotiation, after all, is all about persuasion, making my side look good and yours look weak, and even if we're trying to find some win-win situation, there is an element of casting doubt on each other's initial proposals, and casting doubt can quickly become a fib, and then a lie, and then we start questioning, is it okay to lie in a negotiation? And there may be some other behaviors that we engage in which may cross the lines of ethics and fairness. And we also have to consider whether or not these concepts are separable or are they intertwined. So let's stick with the question of, is it ever okay to lie? The answer is maybe, and by the time you get to the end of this, your answer to that might be different. So here's the first scenario we want to look at. John wants to sell his car for no less than $5,000. He needs at least $4,000 by June 10th to pay off another debt. Sandra needs a car but doesn't want to spend more than $4,000, although she could pay up to $6,000. And she needs to have a car by June 5th. Today is June 1st, so the clock is ticking. John tells Sandra he has another buyer, Pete, who is very interested, and Pete has made an offer of $5,600. But since Sandra is a friend, John is willing to talk with her first before he gets back to Pete, but he makes a point of saying, I do have to get back to Pete fairly quickly. So let's look at the first question. Assume that there really is no Pete. John just made him up and doesn't have another offer. Sandra doesn't have any other immediate choices within her price range, so she makes an offer of $5,800 to ensure she has a car by her deadline. Pause for a minute here and jot down whether or not you think there are any fairness or ethical problems with John's behavior. John has clearly lied, and he's done it for personal gain. So there is definitely a fairness problem here, and there's probably a violation of an ethical standard along the way. Now, let's look at scenario 2. Assume that there really is an offer from Pete, but that the offer includes a payment plan where he'll pay John in 3 installments, the last of which will be paid on June 15th, so it doesn't quite make John's need of having $4,000 by June 10th. Are there problems with this scenario?
John didn't directly lie. He did omit a key fact, but it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of what would be called a material fact. And it's also likely that Sandra didn't even know about John's timetable, so there really aren't any problems with the first question in scenario 2. Now, does it make a difference if John didn't need to have $4,000 by June 10th, but that Sandra is unaware that Pete's offer includes paying in installments? That might actually change the game against John, because if installment payments were an issue, that might change Sandra's position. So omitting can be dangerous to both sides. Now, before we look at some more scenarios, let's look at a few definitions. Here is the definition of fairness according to Black's Law Dictionary. Having the qualities of impartiality and honesty, free from prejudice and favoritism and self-interest. This is in a bit of conflict with the premise of negotiation. Any party in negotiation obviously has some self-interest to protect. Even in a principled negotiation, you're looking out for yourself. You are trying to get some gain. So fairness isn't quite as clear-cut. Generally, when people look at fairness, they look at it not so much from the legal perspective, but from the global perspective. Was this person treated in a just manner? So be cautious when you're tossing about the term fair. But now let's move down the slope a little bit farther to exaggeration and its cousins, puffery and deception. Exaggeration and puffery are very close in nature. They're what we think of usually in salesman tactics. This is the best price you'll find for a car in such good condition. And often the dividing line is opinion versus fact. The fact that I think this is a car that's in fabulous condition and you won't get a better price for it is my opinion. And going into a negotiation, people are going to have to assume that the other side is going to engage in some sort of behavior like this to bolster their position. So these aren't always the greatest things, but of course the bigger that exaggeration and puffery gets, the more obvious they are. Deception is when you start sliding down the slope. The act of deceiving an intentional misrepresentation by falsehood spoken or acted. The more degree of intention to bring about a personal gain, the more difficult the situation becomes is to discern it from a problem with just saying that my opinion of this, or representing that this is the general public's opinion, as opposed to going to something that is more factual in nature. And that leads us to misrepresentation. Any manifestation by words or other conduct by one person to another that under the circumstances amounts to an assertion that is not in accordance with the facts. Now, there are different types of misrepresentation. Let's go back to John and Sandra for a minute. John tells Sandra that the car always starts on the first try in the winter. If that really has been John's experience, and he maintains the car with proper care and the battery is reasonably new, yet when Sandra buys it on the first day of December, it doesn't start on the first try, that's probably what would be called an innocent misrepresentation. John has not gone out of his way to exaggerate what would be facts, whether or not the car actually starts and what condition it's in. So while Sandra might feel she's been deceived in some way, John really didn't do anything that was wrong in this scenario. But let's look at the definition of negligent misrepresentation. It's a false representation as to a past or existing fact, such as whether or not the car started, whether or not it has a new battery, and there are no reasonable grounds to believe the statement is true. The statement is made to persuade the other party to rely on it, and the other party did in fact rely on it, acted because of that reliance, and as a consequence suffered some damages. Now, if negligent misrepresentation is proven, it's usually a civil matter in the court system, and the resolution is usually the rescission of the contract and repayment of the purchase price and perhaps some damages. So it's really putting the parties back as if the contract never existed. Let's look at the next scenario. If John has not really had problems starting the car, but knows that the battery is 3 years old and that Sandra will be parking it outside in the winter, and he had been parking it in the garage, but he still tells her it starts every time, now you have an element of intent. This is probably erring more on the side of negligent misrepresentation. If all of the above is true and John definitely has had problems starting it, then it clearly is a case of negligent misrepresentation. Now let's move to fraud, which is at the farthest end of the deceptive practices that can happen in a negotiation. Fraud is an intentional perversion of the truth for the purpose of inducing another in reliance upon it to part with some valuable thing belonging to that person or to surrender a legal right. It can also be defined as a knowing misrepresentation of a material fact made for the purpose of inducing another party to take some sort of action, or as stated here, give up a legal right. So knowing and material are two critical terms in the definition of fraud. It is unlikely that parties who have studied and are focusing on principled negotiation are going to get to this point, as is it that their contracts might result in violating another legal principle, but it's important to pause and review the issue of unconscionability. This is probably something you covered in your construction law class, but it's important so it bears repeating here. It's a doctrine under which courts may deny the enforcement of a contract because of procedural abuses in the formation of contract and substantive abuses in relating to the terms of the contract. While the definition puts it in an either-or situation, most courts have ultimately interpreted it as requiring both of those elements. So just look at those quickly. Procedural is unequal bargaining power, such as when an arbitration clause is buried in a 500-page handbook, which constitutes a company contract. Or a party is knowingly uneducated and the other party seeking the benefit of the contract has taken advantage of that, or perhaps it's a very technical matter and the party has written a very highly technical contract. Also, not being given enough time. You're handed a multi-page contract with 7 X's on it, and the person is drumming their fingers, and you're told just sign where all the X's are. You're not given fair bargaining power in reviewing those terms and at least making the offer or the suggestion that they be changed. The second element is substantive unconscionability, which is unfairly oppressive contract terms. Let's go back to that arbitration clause in the handbook. Just because there's an arbitration clause in the handbook does not make it oppressive or unfair, but if that arbitration clause has very restrictive unilateral limits on it, it says that you, consumer here in Boston, if you have a dispute with us, can only resolve it by arbitration. You may not go to court, and that arbitration must be held in Hawaii. That has made it a very unreasonable arbitration clause and one that would be considered oppressive. Take it or leave it, contracts of adhesion in consumer settings are again often considered oppressive contract terms, and if they also meet the test of unequal bargaining power, then the contract will likely be rescinded. So it is unlikely, again, that these will come up in principled negotiations, but it's important to be aware of these legal concepts. So let's go back and look at a couple more scenarios. Now assume that John still wants to sell for at least $5,000 and Sandra has a range of $4,000 to $6,000. Sandra in this scenario doesn't know much about cars, but believes that John has a very strong automotive knowledge. She did take the car for a test drive with John, and the car seemed to run pretty well. John invests a moderate amount of time in the care and maintenance of the car, and last year he spent about $900 on repair. The car is 6 years old. Other than taking the drive with Sandra and giving her the age of the car, John doesn't really focus on how much time, money, and effort he puts into maintaining the car. Now, Sandra, in this scenario, has another option of a car, but it's at the top end of her bargaining range, and she doesn't want to go to that reservation price, so she offers John $5,200. Are there any problems with John's behavior here? Probably need to know more facts to give a clear answer to this. For instance, how much did John know about how much Sandra was relying on what she perceived to be his expert opinion of cars? That might push his action a little bit more along the lines of misrepresentation. But if he was ignorant of her relying so heavily on his knowledge, well, this might not be entirely fair because of his omission. It probably meets the ethical test. Now, what we've covered for the most part are some standards that go to the legal arena. Let's look at just some quick general standards of ethics. There's one's own personal code of conduct. How does one like to interact with other people in a mode of honesty and being treated as they would want to be treated if they were on the other side? There are also organizational and professional codes which may dictate which actions a party can and can't take in a negotiation. Another way to look at a situation is if a family friend or a trusted mentor or a respected colleague were looking at how I conducted myself here, what would they think of me? And there's always the headline test. If the facts of this negotiation were put out in the Boston Globe tomorrow, what would people